I believe that Breath of the Wild is a good game. You probably could have guessed that by now. But a big question is it a good Zelda game? One thing has been consistent throughout all of my time talking about Zelda with people on and off the internet, and believe me, that has taken up a significant amount of my life, and it's that Zelda means something different for everyone. Everyone has a different idea of what elements make a Zelda game a Zelda game. Want to do a fun experiment? Ask 5 people to rank all the 3D Zeldas from best to worst, and you will get 5 very different answers. And that's actually one of the things I love about Zelda. One person may play it for the story, another may think it's all about the fighting, another may think nothing is more important than dungeons, and another person may think nothing's more important than dungeons, yet still disagree with the previous person on which dungeons are best. But the whole what makes a Zelda a good Zelda discussion has never been as heated as it is now. Breath of the Wild changed Zelda. Every Zelda game has added ideas and tweaked them. Skyward Sword, in particular, as I've mentioned many times, probably changed the most at the time. But with Breath of the Wild, Aonuma and the Zelda team broke the system open completely. For the first time in decades, they took a great big step back and examined every single individual element that made up the series, and considered, does this need to be here? How can we make this better? What if we did this instead? Even staple mechanics that had been there since the very beginning were not exempt from this great purge. A good few examples. Bottles. They're just gone. You've got a massive inventory and you can just collect materials with the push of a button, so there was simply no need to include a bottle system. Collecting heart containers. I never imagined we would get a game that threw out such a long-standing tradition as heart containers, but there you go. Spirit orbs are like heart containers in that you can trade 4 of them for 1 extra heart, but they're used for stamina as well, and they are exclusively given to you in shrines. You don't find them out in the wild, hidden in chests and holes. The overall dungeon format. No boss keys, no progression items to find, no mini-boss at the halfway point. Instead, we've got loads and loads of mini-dungeons along with 4 bigger dungeons that are very unlike anything we've ever played. The ability to jump. Like, to just jump whenever you want. You don't have to get Rock's Feather, you don't run at a ledge to make it happen automatically. You just do it with a button. Because why not? It makes sense to be able to jump in this world, it's really useful, so there it is. Special arrows. They have always been an ability that you get, and you use them to get past certain obstacles that were designed for them. Here you just get them. You don't get the fire arrow ability, you get a fire arrow. You can use it on a guy that doesn't like fire if you want, or a shock arrow, or whatever. They're a resource, they run out. Here's a huge one. You know Zelda games, right? You're this guy wearing these green clothes and you have that one sword. Not here. Where's Link's tunic? Well, he doesn't have it. Put on whatever armor you find in the world. Where's the Master Sword? Well, you get it later in the game, and even when you do, you can only use it for a little while at a time, so how about instead you pick up whatever weapons you come across and use those? I've played the game for so long that I'm used to it now, but sometimes I'm reminded just how weird this is. How weird it is to be playing a Zelda game where I'm wearing wacky outfits and using spears and hammers that I scavenged from enemies. Sometimes it doesn't even look like I'm playing a Zelda at all. There's smaller stuff too, like how you can move the camera around when you're talking to someone. It's not a huge deal, but it's still something where they were like, why not? Why the heck not? It makes it a little more interesting to talk to someone and still be interacting with the game and looking around. And you know that annoying sound Zelda games make when you're low on hearts? That whip-it-up, whip-it-up, it's awful. Gonzo! Breath of the Wild makes a noise to let you know that you're low, and then it shuts up. And you know what? It's not just the big changes that tell us how much they rethought the whole Zelda formula here. This little stuff says just as much. It means they really examined every single little thing and asked themselves if each one was something they needed. This game being so different, instead of people saying, I like this Zelda game more than the last one, or I like it less than the last one, or I rank it like this compared to the others, you've got people either seeing this as the best Zelda ever created, or something so different that it isn't even Zelda anymore. Obviously, there are plenty of people in between, but to me, it seems more binary than ever. And funny thing is, neither camp is wrong. Because what is a Zelda game? How much can you change a game in a series before it doesn't resemble the other entries in the series enough to be part of the series anymore? How much can get thrown out? How much do you need to keep? When is it healthy innovation, and when is it compromising a series identity? Breath of the Wild is very different from the other 3D Zeldas, but it actually has a lot in common with the first Zelda on the NES. There we were just plunked down in a huge open world and told to go. It's also a lot like Link Between Worlds, with its dungeon dungeons that could be completed in any order, and it's items that you could access at any time. If 3D Zeldas and 2D Zeldas are different in a lot of ways, does that mean they need to maintain their own identities without spilling over? If Breath of the Wild is wildly different from every other 3D Zelda, but very similar to the original Zelda, does that make it the least Zelda-like Zelda game ever, or the most Zelda-like Zelda game ever? If no other Zelda game had ever been created, just the first one and this one, how differently would we look at it as a continuation of the series? How much should a game be judged against the games that came before it, and how much should it be judged on its own merits? These are questions that we could spend hours going over. But at the end of the day, like I said, there are no correct answers. All I can do is answer these questions for myself. I can only tell you what I see when I look at this game. And I suppose I'm one of the lucky ones because these changes amaze me. There have been some sacrifices, sure. Like I've talked about, there are some traditional Zelda elements that have been left behind or diminished, and sometimes I find myself missing the purity of the old formula. But so much of the new stuff here is just incredible. It's engaging and exciting and challenging. And instead of feeling like the game has strayed too far from the Zelda formula, I feel like it elevates Zelda to new places, forges a path for bigger and better Zelda games than ever. And this new direction for Zelda didn't just happen because the team rethought every element and brainstormed new concepts. It's obvious that they drew heavy inspiration from other games. This is huge because Nintendo's teams most often seem, at least, to do their own thing when it comes to game design. And hey, that's part of what makes them so unique. But if you ask me, Zelda was in need of a shakeup, and looking outward was one of the best things they could have done to make that shakeup happen. The new elements that seem to have been inspired by other games are what make the game feel so fresh and exciting. A new mechanic is one thing, but a whole new system or style that we've enjoyed in other games coming over to Zelda, it's incredible. There's no way to know exactly what was directly inspired by other sources or what those sources might be, but the way I see it, there are three elements that have been largely lifted from other games. One source of inspiration seems to be Dark Souls and or Monster Hunter, or at least that style of game. Primarily, this is seen in the combat and boss difficulty. You can see it most clearly when you're swinging around a giant sword and fighting some huge guy. I mean, it really does look like Monster Hunter sometimes. It uses the idea of large, fierce enemies that you really have to learn in order to kill. As I've gone over many times by now, it's less about figuring out how to open up an enemy like a puzzle by using the right item, and more about just learning them and beating them with pure skill. This is a very new concept for Zelda, and I don't think it's any coincidence that these kinds of games were on the rise when Breath of the Wild was early in development. Another inspired element of Breath of the Wild is the survival element, and similarly, I do not believe this happened by simple chance. Survival games were also on the rise during development. I mean, the genre basically exploded around that time, so now we have the lack of recovery hearts and the need to gather food and cook meals and elixirs. This and the new fighting style obviously come from the team's desire to make Zelda more challenging, and this new level of challenge is part of what makes the game feel so much more rewarding than previous titles. Then, of course, there's the obvious one. The open world. Leading up to Breath of the Wild's release, Nintendo's games were only getting more and more linear. But again, what other kinds of games were on the rise when Breath of the Wild was being made? Just about every publisher out there was putting out open world games. They were creating gigantic worlds that you could explore in your own way, at your own pace, and that were packed with stuff to do. Whether or not that stuff was fun to do is up for debate, but they were still doing it. So the Zelda team looked at those games, then they looked over at Skyward Sword in the direction they had previously been taking Zelda, then they shot a quick glance over at Wind Waker before returning to Breath of the Wild, and they went, all right, let's do this. Let's give them what they've been asking for. Let's do an open world Zelda. And because they did that, because they decided to look outside of Zelda for inspiration and adapt all these new elements to the series, I believe we have a deeper and more engaging Zelda than ever. And before anyone says it, no, I don't think this means they should always just copy exactly what the rest of the industry is doing. They shouldn't just follow trends, but they should always keep an eye out for ideas that could legitimately enhance the Zelda experience and carefully select which ones to use, as I believe they've done here. And you know what? I will completely admit that the game probably doesn't deserve quite as much credit as it gets for these changes. The rest of the game industry grows and develops together. Games constantly borrow concepts from each other and try to improve on old formulas. Should we really praise the Zelda team for finally looking at what the rest of the industry was doing like they probably should have been doing to at least some extent this whole time? Should we praise this game for, in a sense, merely catching up to other games when it comes to a lot of its mechanics? If countless other games have perfected the survival concept, why should should we give Zelda so much credit for only dabbling in it? If other games have been offering deeper, more challenging combat for years, why is it special when Zelda does it? Nintendo fans often treat the company's games like they're in their own special little bubble, and I will completely admit I probably do that sometimes as well. I'll admit that it's special when Zelda does it because, to me, Zelda is just special. Nintendo franchises have this way of burrowing into my heart, and when I boot up a game, if it's got the name Zelda on the cover, it's already at an advantage in my eyes. Is this a rational mindset to have? I'd say yes and no. Sure, maybe I am being a little biased here. Maybe I hold these games to a different standard sometimes. I don't really know, and I don't know if I can know. But there's nothing wrong with being captivated by that certain kind of Nintendo magic. I don't think there's anything wrong with being so enamored with the style and feel of the Zelda universe that if Zelda uses a mechanic, I'm more likely to enjoy it than if another game does it even better. It's like, come on, man, that is a bias. But it's also like, I know that other game uses this mechanic too, but Zelda uses it here. I couldn't tell you exactly what Zelda magic even is or what elements come together to create it, but whatever it is, it's real and it's got me. Zelda games almost always meet a certain quality standard in my mind. They let me go on adventures the likes of which I just can't get anywhere else. And even if another game's got perfect survival or crafting or combat elements or anything, it still doesn't have the benefit of coming together to form a complete Zelda experience. Even with its flaws and underbaked elements, Breath of the Wild is still a Zelda game when you look at it as a whole. It's still got that quality and magical feel. It's still the kind of adventure game that, for whatever reason, no one else is really making right now. No one ever seems to make adventure games that feel quite as good as Zelda does. And speaking of flaws, as we've seen in this review, this game's got plenty of them. It is so different and new that there are some crazy growing pains. Even its inspired elements need a whole lot of tweaking and refining. The survival stuff is great, but the game's got some issues with difficulty balance. Eventually, it becomes too easy to pig out on all the health regenerating items you want, and the ability to eat them in the pause menu without interrupting a battle compromises the new level of challenge. Then there's the whole system of material gathering without a proper crafting system to go with it. There just isn't enough stuff to spend your money and monster teeth on. The progression system could also use some work. Getting stronger simply by picking up stronger weapons as the game scales up doesn't feel incredibly empowering. A proper XP system or something like it would work much better. Then of course there's the story and the ending. I went to town on the game there. I mean, geez, I probably spent half my review complaining. This game has a lot of problems, lots of niggling annoyances and missed opportunities. But it's a perfect example of how I can think a game is incredibly flawed, but still consider it one of the best games I've ever played. Because I do think that about Breath of the Wild. I still need more time to decide if it's my absolute favorite game ever, but it just might be. This is really a larger discussion for another day, but I don't see a review score as this objective measure of a game's quality. When I'm scoring a game, the most important factor is how much I enjoyed it. I'm not going to do the whole, give Breath of the Wild a 7 out of 7 thing at the end of the review. It seems silly to do that at this point. But yeah, for the record, if I'm going to score it, I am going to give it a 7. And yes, that's despite the fact that there's so much wrong with it. It's because the stuff that it does right, it does so right. Even if I felt like it could have been better considering what it brought to the table, it still provided what was possibly the most magical experience of my video game playing life. I honestly can't remember a time that I had more fun with a game, felt more unbridled joy while playing it. Certainly not since I was a kid, back when that magical feeling was much easier to find. Games just don't tend to affect me as much as they did when I was a kid. My ability to lose myself completely to a game has gotten a little weaker over the years. But Breath of the Wild tapped back into that kid in me. It brought me back to Christmas mornings when I could boot up a game and just stare at it and wonder. When I could just lose myself in a game for days and days and truly feel like I was experiencing something special. I was going on a grand adventure. And I know it's kind of a weird thing to say, but all of Breath of the Wild's flaws are kind of exciting. Think about it. If I was able to enjoy the game this much despite its laundry list of issues and missed opportunities and seemingly missing mechanics, that means that as long as the Zelda team wants to continue with this formula, and statements from Aonuma himself plus sales figures make that all but a sure thing, the only way to go is up. Future games can only get better. Way better. Impossibly better. Sure, it would have been cool if Breath of the Wild was just the perfect video game right out of the gate, But where could it have gone from there after setting the bar so high? I'm kinda glad I got to be blown away by its crazy open world and some of its new elements, because now I can potentially be blown away all over again by a more fully realized version of this new formula. I mean, I guess I don't necessarily know if the team will work on improving what they have here, or if they'll just scrap half of it and go in yet another new direction, but they've got the potential to do something amazing with Zelda. Something truly unprecedented in the ever-crowded landscape of open-world adventure games. The Zelda magic used to live inside its own little box, and it was a wonderful box, but it was still a box and one of its own creation. But this game has broken free. It moves the series so far in such a new direction so quickly that now it feels like the sky's the limit. And for that reason, I would say it's the most important game since Ocarina of Time, for both the series and Nintendo as a whole. It shows a willingness to take inspiration and break traditions and try exciting new things that the company has sorely needed for years. It shows that they're willing to make a game that doesn't hold your hand, and that they finally understand how gamers want challenge, they want depth, they want to forge their own adventures. Nintendo will never be perfect, and at the risk of sounding overly pessimistic, I know they'll never fully live up to the potential I see in them. They just don't have the same priorities I do. But Breath of the Wild paints as bright a picture as I could ever hope for. It says something very profound about Nintendo's shifting mindset, their potential, and the kinds of games we might see from them in the future. It seems we have come to the end of my little review of The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild. Perhaps it doesn't come as a surprise that I was able to talk about the game for hours, considering how obsessed I am with it. What does surprise me, though, is how even after all that time, I still can't say I've touched on everything. There are countless things I just couldn't fit anywhere, or I decided to skip for the sake of something that in some universe resembles brevity. Like blood moons. Didn't even talk about blood moons. I can sum them up right here, though. Ah! Ah! I am going to die! I am going to die! Is it over? What happened? Then I mentioned Eventide once or twice, but I could probably talk for quite a while about that one quest alone. It's incredible! And you've got Kilton and how he can make disguises that let you blend in with monsters, and the ability to take pictures of things and hunt them down with what is essentially a radar? That's a whole thing in itself! It's like a fully realized version of the dowsing idea in Skyward Sword, but you know what? I gotta draw the line somewhere. This review does have to eventually end. I was originally gonna end the whole thing with another heartfelt bit about how special and amazing Breath of the Wild is, but I think I've made my point by now. So instead, I just want to say thank you. If you stuck with me through this entire review, then I seriously thank you from the bottom of my heart. The idea that even one person on this great big planet would want to hear me talk about one game for 3 hours is absurd, but all you guys, it just feels amazing, and all the comments and tweets from people who have enjoyed it throughout its production have warmed my Zelda-loving heart. And while I'm thanking people, give it up once again for Kane from Farfetch'd Reviews for editing this entire thing. He is the link to my Zelda. I've been doing a lot of brooding, trying to figure things out, locked in what's felt like a century-long battle with scripts and mechanics and analyses, and he's been doing all the dirty work, wielding his sword of editing against the calamity that is this review. And with that, my friends, I will take my bow and bid you all adieu. Gosh, I've talked about it for so long that, you know what I think I might just do? I think my Switch and I are gonna spend a little time playing something else. Woof! I am sick of Breath of the Wild. When's the next Zelda game come out already? Know what I'm gonna do? I'm gonna play some Mario. Yeah. Good old run and jump Mario. Yep. Hey, look, a moon. Yeah. Got that moon.